So we've talked about the goodwill as this conviction, this commitment to do the right thing. What is the right thing? I mean, deontology is all about the moral law. That's like literally what deontology means, is like the study of the moral law. And so what is the moral law? What is the right thing to do? That's what we're going to talk about in this video. Let's get to it. So I'm hoping that we're going to start kind of bringing everything together. I feel like a lot of this material can feel very disparate, we're just like, hey, here's this idea over here and here's this idea over here. And I want to start trying to bring those ideas together. Hopefully you remember the 3 parts of an ethical theory. This is something I would definitely ask on a midterm exam, on a final exam, on both. We've got a criterion of right, a decision procedure, and a theory of value. Those are the 3 parts of an ethical theory. And one way you can kind of check to make sure that you understand what's going on, or even to build an ethical theory of your own, is to, establish these 3 parts. We actually already have 2 of them. We have a criterion of right. The right act is the one that follows the moral law. Okay? We also have a theory of value. That's where the goodwill comes in, right? The goodwill is the only thing that's good, that's valuable without qualification. Other things might other things might be valuable, but they need to be qualified, right? It's not just pleasure that's valuable. It's, non-sadistic pleasure, but also you need other qualifications too. It's not just wealth that's valuable. It's, non-excessive wealth, and more qualifications are probably needed too. But the goodwill, dude, that's incorruptible, right? That's always going to be valuable no matter what. So we've got 2/3 of the picture. What we need is a way to figure out what the moral law is. This is where the categorical imperative comes in. This is how we figure out what the moral law says. So in order to understand what the categorical imperative is, I like to start with what we might call a hypothetical imperative. It's hypothetical because, it might not be the case that you want this thing, right? That's the if part of this. So if you want such and such, then you should, the should is our imperative part, you should do this. So for example, if you want to win the chess game, then you should make this move. Now, there's probably in a lot of positions on a chessboard, there's probably, an objectively best move to make. And so if you want to win the chess game, this is the move you should make. But you might not want to win the chess game. Maybe you're playing like your little brother and you're trying to teach him how to play chess. I don't want to obliterate the kid, so maybe I'll make a blunder, or, make a suboptimal move and see if my little brother can, catch it and take my piece or whatever. And so if I'm teaching my little brother how to play chess, then maybe this is the move that I should make. That's what we mean by a hypothetical imperative, and these can be, more or less rational. If I were to, run into you at the bar and you're slamming down shots and I'm like, hey, what are you doing? You're like, well, I'm trying to get good at tennis. What? That doesn't make any sense at all, right? If you want to get good at tennis, then you should go drink at a bar. No, that doesn't make any sense. There are rational things that you ought to do in order to achieve some end that you want. So the difference between a hypothetical and a categorical imperative is it doesn't have this if part. There is no if about it. Remember, you have a commitment to do the morally correct thing. You have this, conviction to do it. It's the goodwill. You have this goodwill. And so we don't need to put any ifs about it. It's just, you should do this. Boom, we're done. That's what makes it categorical. It always applies. It's always there going on in the background. Now, one question that I kind of get sometimes from students, well, not sometimes, literally all the time from students, is what about really bad people? Like, what about like the Ted Bundys of the world and stuff like that? And I have a couple of thoughts here. I mean, my initial thought is that like, it's not super obvious, to me at least, that like, people like Ted Bundy lacked the goodwill, right? It's just that maybe they didn't often act on it, at least when they were like hurting people, they weren't acting on it. And that sort of brings in the other piece of that. Like, do we really have to think of these people as like never having like held a door open for somebody just because it's like a nice thing to do or whatever? I mean, maybe, but you know, we can kind of like think about those kind of worries, and they're a fun thing to think about in the discussion forum. But you know, I don't want to like overly pathologize people or like speak to, you know, somebody who may or may not have some kind of severe mental illness. It's definitely not my place. But it would be, I think, a little bit quick to just say that like, oh, well, so and so has this condition, therefore like they just completely lack the goodwill. And that just feels a little bit too quick is all. But that's something we can talk about in the discussion areas. So this is what the categorical imperative is. You should do X because you have the goodwill, right? We are going to talk about these two formulations. There's three or four, depending on how you count them. Kant like has two kind of next to each other, and maybe they're two different ones. Maybe they're the same thing. I don't know. I'm not a Kant scholar. These are the two we're going to talk about because they're both, I think, like the strongest way of thinking about Kant, I think at least. And so unpacking each of these will be really, really interesting. Now, what Kant says is that like the categorical imperative itself is like this almost like ethereal kind of like, you should do the right thing. These different formulations, he says, are all equivalent ways of saying the same thing. It doesn't seem like that's the case. We're going to look at some situations where it's like, yeah, that really doesn't seem like it's the case. I mean, just looking at these two different formulations of the categorical imperative, they don't seem equivalent just at a surface reading. But again, I'm not a Kant scholar. I don't know. So this is just kind of something to keep in mind. It's an interesting little, I guess, kind of quirk of his view. I don't know how much really hinges on that idea, though. But let's talk about each of these. So act only according to that maxim. Remember, a maxim is your policy for action, right? What are you doing and why are you doing it? So act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should be a universal law. In other words, we're only going to act on maxims that we can imagine like describe human behavior for all time. Not just like from now on, but like this is how humans have acted since there have been humans. This is what we mean by universalizability. The Humanity Formulation, what we're going to do here, and we'll swing back around to this, we're only going to treat humans not as a mere means to an end, but as an end unto themselves. And we'll spend a little bit of time unpacking what that means. But let's talk about the Universal Law Formulation first. The idea here is that wrongful or immoral maxims cannot be universalized. They cannot be turned into these universal laws. So what we're going to do is take your maxim and then say, okay, let's just suppose this has applied to like, this just describes human behavior for all of time, right? Since the beginning of time. And, you know, so just like how gravity kind of, you know, describes how planets, you know, move with respect to one another, these maxims will describe how humans interact with one another. What we'll see is that wrongful maxims will lead to a contradiction. Like a straight up, like it's raining and it's not raining. I'm standing and I'm not standing. You know, this is a square and it's not a square, right? Like a straight up contradiction. Here is the classic example of how this works. So, you need 20 bucks. So you tell your friend like, hey, can I borrow 20 bucks? I promise I'll pay you back. But you have no intention of paying that person back. This is a lying promise. Now, this is different from a broken promise, right? Where I did intend to pay them back and like I just, maybe something happened and I couldn't. So broken promise and lying promise. Broken promise still not good, but not quite what we're talking about here. We're talking about a promise that you have no intent whatsoever to fulfill. Okay, so your maxim is going to be something like, I will make a lying promise in order to get $20. Here is the generalized version of it. Make a lying promise in order to get what I desire. Here's what's going to happen. So we're going to suppose that this maxim right here, make a lying promise in order to get what I want, this describes how humans have and will continue to behave for all time. We are going to get a straight up contradiction. First, it just kind of has to be the case that promises exist, right? I mean, it's part of my maxim, right? To make this so-called promise to my friend. So promises have to exist in this world that I'm imagining. But here's the thing. Promises can't possibly exist. Because any time anybody promises something, what that means literally is that like they have no intention of doing that thing. If I tell you, so in this world that we're imagining, right? If I say, hey, I promise I'm going to pick you up at the airport, what I literally mean is I have no intention of picking you up at the airport, right? There's no way to like assure someone that something is going to be the case. So promises cannot exist because like nobody's going to believe them, right? As an institution, they just can't possibly exist. But they have to exist because they're part of my maxim. Promises both do and do not exist at the same time. That's a contradiction. And so this maxim is immoral, and we have identified an aspect of the moral law. That is a lot. But that is sort of the process that this kind of goes through. Now, one really, really important caveat here. We are not asking the question, what if everybody did this? That is like, I'll hear students, even sometimes like, philosophers like talk about Kant, like, oh, what if everybody did this? That is a very consequentialist thing to say. There's nothing wrong with it. Like, if you wanted to be a consequentialist and have some kind of like universalizability criterion, like, oh, littering is wrong because if everybody littered, the world would be full of trash. Like, that's a totally fine, like, way to approach moral thinking. But it's a consequentialist way of thinking, not a deontological way of thinking. It's not just that, in this world, people aren't going to trust anybody. It's not just that like, oh, trust is going to break down or it'd be a bad world to live in or anything like that. This world can't even possibly exist. This is not a possible world. This is a world where, squares are circles and 2 + 2 is 5. There is no world like that. So this would be like asking like, hey, do you think people are happy in worlds where 2 + 2 is 5? Like, what do you mean? There are no worlds. So there are not going to be any people in those worlds to be happy in the first place. So that's what's wrong with this kind of thought here, is that there aren't any people to trust anybody, because this is just not a possible world. We end at the point where, we get this contradiction and we say, okay, the maxim is immoral, and so we cannot make lying promises. This right here is the 4-step process that we would go through in order to determine whether a given maxim is morally permissible or morally impermissible. So, We're going to figure out what your maxim is. What are you doing? Why are you doing it? And then we're going to generalize it, right? We're going to put it in the most general form that we can. And then we're going to ask this question that we just asked. Can this maxim be universalized? Can it be turned into like a law of nature that describes the way that people have acted for all time? If it can't, then we have identified what we can call a perfect duty. If it can be universalized, but we could not rationally will ourselves to live in such a world, what we have is called an imperfect duty. Let's go through this real quick and just see how this 4-step process kind of unpacks. Real quick though, perfect versus imperfect duties. Perfect duties, let me be clear. Neither of these duties should ever be violated, okay? If you have a choice in the matter, you should not be violating any moral duties ever, okay? Violating moral duties is immoral. Where this kind of comes into play, though, is let's suppose that for some reason I need to violate an imperfect duty in order to uphold a perfect duty. That would be permissible, and that would be the only time that violating an imperfect duty would be permissible. Another big difference between the two that you might notice from these examples here, right? For perfect duties, don't kill, don't lie, don't steal, don't make false promises. For imperfect duties, do help others, do develop your talents, do pursue your own happiness. Perfect duties are prohibitions on acting. They're saying, hey, don't do these things. Imperfect duties are telling you to do stuff. They're sort of like telling you to positively bring about things. So that's going to be a key difference here. So let's apply these to like 2 different cases and see how things get cashed out. So let's talk about stealing. Stealing is obviously not okay to do. Let's see how Kant would handle it. So, my neighbor just got a new, really big TV, and I'm like, that is a dope TV. I want to take it. So, here is step 1. Here's my maxim. I'm going to take my neighbor's TV. I'm going to steal it in order to get something that I want. Okay. I'm now going to generalize it, right? Just put it in its most general form, which is going to be something like this. Take another person's property, in order to get what you want, right? If you want something, take it. Okay, so there's the generalized form, and what we end up with is a pretty quick contradiction. We end up in a world in which property both does and does not exist. Property needs to exist because, I want to own this television that my neighbor has, right? I want it to be mine. But if everybody just takes everything that they just if they see something, they want it and they take it, the notion of ownership or property is never ever going to come about in a world like this, right? So property both does and does not exist in this world that I'm trying to imagine. I've got a straight up contradiction, so it fails step 3, and when we fail step 3, we've got a perfect duty. Don't steal. Okay? Let's look at another one. Okay, so we've got a stranger. They ask you for $10. You've got plenty of money. This would not be a hardship to you. The only reason that you don't want to give them anything is because you don't owe them anything. And you're like, I don't owe you anything. Whatever. Okay, so again, here's your maxim. I'm not going to give money to this person asking because I don't owe them anything. And here's the generalized version. So, just in general, don't help those that you don't owe anything to. So a parent caring for their kid, that's a specific duty. A teacher caring for their student, that's a specific duty. But just don't help other people that you have no specific duty towards. Can I universalize this? Yeah, sure. I can imagine a world in which nobody really helps anybody. The thing is, though, that world is not very conducive to things like self-improvement, sort of bettering myself, or, getting what I need to sort of like have a good life. And so I wouldn't be able to rationally will myself like, oh yeah, this is a great place. I want to live in this kind of a world. It's what we would call a contradiction in the will. It's not a contradiction in conception. It's not a straight up like, hey, promises exist and don't exist, or, duties exist and don't exist. It's not like that. But the will kind of like contradicts itself, because I couldn't rationally, want or get myself to live in a world like this, because and we all just depend too much on other people kind of doing stuff for us. So those are the two sort of ways you can identify the moral law. This is how we identify imperfect duties. If it fails step 3, we identify perfect duties. And just really quickly, we'll touch on the Humanity Formulation. So the deal with this: act so that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end unto themselves. Here's what that basically means. Don't use people as a means to an end, or what we should say as a mere means. Using somebody as a mere means versus using somebody as a means. Here's the difference. When I go to the supermarket and I check out with a cashier, assuming they have like actual human cashiers, I am using that cashier as a means to an end, right? I am, using them to get the groceries that I want or whatever. But I'm not using them as a mere means, because they're consenting to this process. They are fully aware of the, the interaction that's happening here, their role in it, my role in it, and they are consenting to sort of being used in this way. Similarly, right, like any time you have a job, right, there are people that are going to be using you to get something that they want. But you are fully aware of this, and presumably you are consenting to this kind of thing. And so you're not being used as a mere means, which is when somebody either doesn't consent or wouldn't consent if they, had full information. So take the lying promise. They can't consent here because they don't have all the information, right? They don't realize that you're lying to them. And if they did, they wouldn't consent to it, right? If they were just like, if you were just like, hey, give me $20, they'd be like, no. Stealing, right? My neighbor. That is, they are not consenting to being used, right? To have their property, stuff that they have, used to, satisfy my greed or desires or whatever that is. Or think about the transplant case that we talked about, where our doctor has 5 patients and she's going to, take their organs out and give them to 5 other patients. The donor, or the person straight up being like killed and having their organs harvested, they certainly wouldn't consent to this. I would imagine, as a donor, you also might not consent to this kind of thing. And so again, this is using people as a mere means. And this is what's really, really cool, is this allows us to respect the autonomy, the individuality of people. What a beautiful idea. There are going to be some cases, it seems like, where these two ideas are going to diverge, right? And one kind of case is, beating somebody up out of revenge. So Bob steals my PlayStation 5, so I go and I beat him up out of revenge. Here's the idea. Harm those who wrong you. That's the generalized form of my maxim, and that seems perfectly universalizable, right? It would be a world in which we kind of like walk on eggshells to make sure we're not harming anybody. But it's a world that I can imagine it doesn't seem to create any like contradictions or anything like that. But on the Humanity formulation, I am using Bob as a mere means, because he's not going to consent to getting beaten up. And I'm using him as a way to satisfy my vengeance. And so this revenge beating up would not be permissible on this view. So again, like we mentioned this before, that these two formulations are supposed to be equivalent. They're getting different results in this case. Something to kind of be aware of. So, if you run something through one analysis and it looks like it might be universalizable, try it through the Humanity formulation and see if it still is. Do you end up using somebody as a mere means? If so, then it's not going to be permissible. You've identified an aspect of the moral law. So that's going to do it for Kant. What we need to do now are starting to look at some objections to the view, and then I want to make sure that we've kind of summarized everything and brought it all together. That's what we'll talk about in this last video. I'll see you then.